Welcome to the Standard of Truth podcast. In this podcast, Dr. Gerrit and Professor Richard Leduc explore the early history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the life and teachings of Prophet Joseph Smith. They examine the original historical sources and provide context for events of the past. They approach the history of the Church with faith, expertise, and humor.
Hi, welcome to another episode of the Standard of Truth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Gerrit, here for part 2 of the podcast that I didn't want to do in the first place, answering a question that I swore I'd never answer, joined by my erstwhile friend, Professor Richard Leduc.
Well, hello, Gerrit. This part 2 is my favorite of the part 2s because you're going to be doing the majority of the reading of the email as you break down each point, which will mean that I won't be poorly reading the email. This has the makings of the best episode we've ever done since the bonus Joseph Smith martyrdom episode where I wasn't on it.
I did reference you.
No, it was actually it was very sweet. It was very kind. And also we keep the people cry out, more Gerrit.
The people cry out. I feel like the people are only crying out because they're forced to as missionaries and they have no other means of listening to anything.
That is entirely possible, but this I have the feeling that that this is going to be really good as you're kind of line by line going through this. There will be parts you will likely get very worked up. As we read the email before, I was
already getting worked up
that you were worked up about. But
that was before I became impassioned.
I will say though, I feel like this does a great service, and one of the things that I've said before, and I'll say it again because I'm probably not going to be talking very much for the next hour, is there's a lot of people that have faith crises and family and friends, and they'll come to somebody who's a faithful member and they'll bring a bunch of things to them, and they won't know all of these citations of sources that or whatever, and it makes it very difficult, and they get frustrated, and sometimes they want to be able to hear somebody articulate what they aren't able to do because they don't necessarily know. And these episodes occasionally, I think, are really valuable and great to the listeners, that somebody who knows all of these things is still a faithful member of the church.
So if you haven't listened to the previous episode, I know it's weird that you're listening to part 2 without part 1. You might be like my wife, who likes to watch, like True Detective type of, investigation discovery things, but also doesn't want to wait to figure out who did it. So she'll start watching it, get a couple minutes in, then fast forward to the end. Oh, it was the chauffeur. How about that? You know what I mean? She wants to know the answer.
It's almost always the boyfriend or husband or wife or girlfriend.
Yeah. And maybe the chauffeur.
Chauffeur.
Well, I said that more like it was some kind of like murder mystery trivia box or something, right? But so if you haven't listened to part 1, please go back and listen, because I start talking about, just as a recap, we had someone ask a question about something that someone had posted pretty definitively on X. And their statement was, did God let Joseph Smith die because Joseph couldn't obey the plural marriage commandment? The question itself, which implied that Joseph never practiced polygamy, upset me. And so we started to go through it, and very quickly I realized we're not going to be able to make it through. So if you need to go back and review that, we talked about the first point that he made. And that first point that he made was definitively to say that Joseph was told that if he lived until he was 85, he'd see the second coming. And that's not what the source actually says. And it's not what Joseph says the source says. So we started off on a little bit of rocky terrain, and so we're going to dive back into that now. Joseph received at least some knowledge of the plural marriage doctrine as early as 1831. See section heading 132. Yes, in section heading 132, that is what it says. And there you're on sound ground that many historians will say that Joseph at least was talking about it, knew about it. And it's certainly what Orson Pratt says. Orson Pratt's very clear that by 1831, Joseph Smith already knew that eventually the plural marriage practice would have to happen. This is a very interesting case where either the next point is either the author doesn't know what the church is saying about this, or they're just hoping people won't check on what they say. I'm not entirely sure what to do with this. In 1833, this is again back to the author. In 1833-34, Joseph met Fanny Alger. It's well understood discussions of plural marriage came up. I don't even know what that sentence means. We have a grand total of 0 contemporary documents related to Joseph and Fanny Alger having a discussion. It's well understood. Again, that's kind of one of those catchphrases, right? When people say it stands to reason. We don't have any statements that plural marriage discussions came up between the two of them. Now, let me move on because there's a bullet point to the second part of this point. Fanny is generally accepted as Joseph Smith's first plural wife. That is a true statement. But records actually don't mention Fanny until 30 years after Joseph died. And then in parentheses, they say, see church history topic Fanny Alger. So that means if I go to church history topic Fanny Alger, what will I find? I'll find it saying that records don't mention Fanny until 30 years after Joseph died, right? Well, luckily we can go to that and we can go see, is that actually going to be the case? And if we go to that, this is under the church history topics, Fanny Alger. This is what it says. Relationship to Joseph Smith. Very little is known about the marriage between Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger. The earliest sources emerged in the aftermath of the collapse of the Kirtland Safety Society in 1837. So the statement just said that there are no sources that reference her until 30 years afterward, except for the ones that happened in 1837, which even a math wizard could help you get to the fact that it wasn't 30 years later.
So it's interesting, though. That might seem like to somebody, okay, well, so this isn't maybe as big of a deal here or whatever. The reason why this is such a big deal is what you always get frustrated when people are saying definitive things that aren't true, or what's the thing that's really...
Well, I mean, there's a couple things. First of all, it's not 30 years later. It's until 30 years after Joseph died. And then they quote the church history topic as having said that. So I think we can all definitively say the church history topic doesn't actually say that, right? I just read it. They just said 1837. Now, my understanding of Joseph Smith's life is that he died in 1844. So 30 years after that would be...
So you're saying that he didn't die in 1807?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay, well, yeah. We'll see.
So that means that we'll see. Yeah, we're going to check. We're going to go crack research staff on that. That is a statement that's being made, and an impressionable member of the church might believe that that's actually the case. What if someone confronts them with Joseph Smith being married to Fanny Alger in the 1830s, and a member of the church says there are no sources that say anything about Fanny Alger until 1874? They would be wrong. And then that anti-Mormon shows them the sources that do exist from the 1830s. And what happens? You've destroyed somebody. You've put their faith in something that isn't even true.
So that I just wanted you to make that point because it seems sometimes...
Because it just seems like I'm a jerk.
Well, no, it doesn't seem like that at all. But it seems like,
everybody listening.
This is, this seems like ticky-tack. But you would rather have someone say, I'm not really sure, rather than to say something definitive that sets somebody up to be destroyed later.
Especially when they're quoting the church. Here's one of the things about quoting the church. When you decide you're going to, you actually have to. Or you can write this and say, look, if you don't believe this, you can write something and say, I don't really know if there's enough evidence for Fanny Alger's marriage. Just write that. But what did you do? You made a statement of fact. Records don't mention actually. Let me correct you. Records actually don't mention Fanny until 30 years after Joseph died.
This speaks to the problem is you have meetings with many people with faith crises, or as we talk to lots of listeners to the show that write in, email in with heartbreaking stories of family members, friends leaving the church, that one of the biggest reasons why people leave isn't necessarily the thing that they heard. It's the feeling that they've been deceived because the thing that they thought is actually wrong.
Right. You might be able to come to terms with the fact, and hopefully you can, because Doctrine and Covenants section 132 exists, that Joseph Smith taught and practiced plural marriage. But what's much harder to come to terms with is that you were giving an answer that someone in the church gave you about how it didn't happen a certain way, and that answer is not true. And so, yes, again, I didn't force this person to make this post. I didn't know that this post existed until we got an email on it. So if you're going to make the decision to make a post, you don't get to misquote the church. Yeah, that's something you don't get to do. If you want to say, I don't really know if Joseph was married to Fanny Alger, then the responsible thing to say is, church records all indicate that Joseph Smith was married to Fanny Alger, but we don't have definitive records, so I'm wondering whether or not he was. Great. Now that's a true statement. Instead, you tried to do both. You tried to argue what you think, but claim that the church is the one that told you that. And that's not what the church said. Okay. He goes on to finally tell us that this is an opinion. I think it's possible he was sealed to her, but not married to her in the traditional sense. Okay, so he's saying it was not really a marriage, it was a sealing, which, again, that's entirely possible because marriages like that with Joseph do happen. So maybe it was just a sealing and not a marriage. Problem, in 1836, this is his next point. In 1836, the sealing power was restored and is the earliest point at which any eternal marriages could have been performed. Okay, but you just told us that Joseph was with Fanny Alger in 1833 or 34, and that's possible that he was sealed to her but not married to her. I guess maybe implied, there's an implication that later he was sealed to her. Is that the argument? If so, no one's making that argument, that's what this is. Again, his earlier statement was that there are no records that mention her. But then his next point is, in 1838, Oliver Cowdery heard about Fanny Alger and accused Joseph of a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. Okay, that is true. So after Oliver Cowdery is excommunicated, or in the process of his excommunication, he writes to a relative, back and forth, talking about this. He writes to Warren Cowdery, talking about his excommunication and the charges that were against him. I will take a little bit of issue is that even though that's how it's usually described. So what's going on now is there's this kind of there are people that are saying that Oliver Cowdery insinuated that Joseph Smith had an affair. Joseph claims that he never told Oliver that, and Oliver is, at least in one place, saying, yes, I never actually said that. So now he's writing a letter to his family member. It's his nephew, but not 7 times removed. And he's saying, this is what I said. So this is what he wrote. I never confessed, intimated, or admitted that I ever willfully lied about him, about Joseph Smith. When he was here, we had some conversation in which in every instance, I did not fail to affirm that what I had said was strictly true. A dirty, nasty, filthy, and actually what was originally written was scrape. Scrape was what was written. Warren Cowdery is going to copy these letters into a letter book, which is a common way of keeping letters, because keeping loose leaf letters doesn't really work. So you get an entire book that when you get a letter, you just recopy the whole thing. Sounds like Presbyterian hell for those of us who are really bad.
Well, you put your albums in there. You put a sunshine face on something, some flowers, a daisy.
When he is copying it over, so this is all in Warren Cowdery's handwriting because it's from his letter book. Scrape is what's originally written, and then affair is written over the top of that. And of course, we don't know when that was done. And so I actually don't know if the original Oliver Cowdery letter even used the word affair.
An affair only has one definition.
No, affair has many, many, many definitions.
Interesting.
But maybe in this case, that's what it meant. But it did originally say scrape. I mean, so maybe,
Scrape has one definition.
no.
Scrape my knee.
Yeah, again, there's a lot of reasons that anyway, so that the nasty, filthy scrape of his and Fanny Alger's was talked over, in which I strictly declared that I had never deviated from the truth on the matter, and as I suppose was admitted by himself. So again, there's not a whole lot of detail that's there.
But the word affair does seem to be the thing that people cling to, right?
Right, because then it tells what they want. Oh, Joseph Smith was caught committing adultery, and that's what this is. So, of course, members of the church are going to say, well, Fanny's Joseph's first plural attempt at plural marriage, something that he knew about as early as 1831. What we're talking about here is someone claiming that that isn't really the case. So this is a point from the Post. Cowdery claimed that Emma told him. That's not true. Okay, so that is a definitive. Nowhere does Cowdery say I heard from Emma. I think what's going on here is the author of this piece is confusing what William McLellin, the excommunicated apostle, would later claim many, many, many years later. He will say that Emma told him.
So when is he saying? Is this possibly the reference to the 30 years after Joseph's death reference, or is that still not?
It is possible, yeah, because it would work out, right? So he's saying it's the first time Fanny's mentioned, but of course that's not the first time Fanny's mentioned, because Oliver Cowdery's letter is still a letter.
So there might just be some crossing of streams between different sources as he's trying to kind of
which demonstrates a much more passion than expertise is what it demonstrates.
So, but what do you say though to the fact that what he feels likely that he's trying to do is trying to help answer a question that a person has about church history,
about why Joseph was martyred?
I don't know.
I mean that's part of the question. What is the question that's being answered here?
Yeah. Well, was Joseph taken from the earth?
Did God have Joseph killed because Joseph couldn't practice polygamy? So here's two problems with that. One, you're claiming God had Joseph killed. Okay. What's our religious source for that? Do we have a prophet that says that? Do we have an apostle that says that? Do we have anyone in contact with God that says that? No. And let's say you're just being a historian. Well, how could I possibly know what the mind of God is, right? Or how God intervenes or doesn't intervene. But the second part of the question is making an assertion of a thing that is not accepted by a single historian. But Cowdery doesn't claim that Emma told him. So I don't know where that even comes from. But Emma herself denied any marriages ever existed. Now that's true. Emma will deny that Joseph ever practiced plural marriage. But it's entirely possible that Emma mentioned sealing and Cowdery presumed a marriage. Okay, so no part of that sentence is backed by literally any source. Cowdery doesn't claim that Joseph was married to Fanny Alger. The source we have from Cowdery is an undescribed scrape, a horrible, nasty scrape that maybe it means affair. Maybe that's what Cowdery's alleging. Cowdery's alleging all kinds of things after his excommunication. So, but no source says that Emma told Cowdery they were married. Cowdery was excommunicated shortly thereafter by a council of elders for his accusation and for basically abandoning his church position for a legal one. That's an incredibly simplistic examination of Cowdery's excommunication, which is highly detailed. You can go read all about that on josephsmithpapers.org. His accusation is not the main reason. His failure to recant it is one of the reasons. But there are other reasons, like he sold land in Jackson County that the church told him not to sell, and which he actually admits in that same letter. Yeah, I sold the land because no one's going to tell me what land I can sell and what I can't. Yeah. Plural marriage doctrine was given by revelation on July 12th, 1843 Now notice this. Now they're trying to draw together their points. Parentheses, 351 days before Joseph died, D&C 132. So there are a lot of problems with that. First, that the plural marriage doctrine given by revelation, it's Joseph who says he's received it before that time. That is when July 12th, 1843 is when the current version of Doctrine and Covenants section 132 is written down by William Clayton. But when asked, when that revelation is being received, whether or not Joseph needs to use the seer stone to the Urim and Thummim to receive it, Joseph's response is, I already have it all memorized. I've got this enough times, right? So the person appears to be trying to make an argument that prior to July 12th, 1843, it wasn't a doctrine given by revelation. I don't know then what you call it when Joseph is told that he's going to be teaching and practicing plural marriage, which the author already asserts. Joseph at least received at least some knowledge of plural marriage doctrine as early as 1831. They seem to be trying to split a hair here, and that the things that Joseph received before that weren't revelation, and it only became revelation when the written revelation was written out by William Clayton. Again, that's a position that the author takes, but that historians don't take. In part, they don't take it because there are records of many, many, many marriages that Joseph Smith is both performing and entering into prior to July 12th, 1843. So if that were the case, that plural marriage wasn't actually a doctrine, it wasn't given by revelation, what is Joseph doing as he's sealing people together prior to that? What's he doing? Is he just, hey guys, I was back out at the Arby's and I just decided, you know what? I'm going to try the fish sandwich. And by the way, William Clayton, you're now married to Ruth Moon. I know you're already married. I mean, Ruth is his first wife, married to Margaret Moon. You're already married to Ruth. Now you're married to Margaret. But it's not a revelation. So Joseph Smith's just sealing people in plural marriages, but is not commanded by God to do it. Even though all of the explanations for plural marriage, both from the women and men involved, is that we're commanded by God to do it. So this argument is trying to split hairs on, but it wasn't really a commandment, a really, really, really commandment until it was written down. Imagine if someone were to make the same argument about the first vision. Joseph Smith didn't really have the first vision because he didn't write it down in 1820. In fact, I feel like there are people who make those arguments. They're called anti-Mormons, who claim that if something isn't written down the moment it happens, it therefore is a lie. Well, that would be the argument that would be being made here. But before that, it was just all fun and giggles.
So perhaps the attempt is to compare it to the word of wisdom, where the word of wisdom is received and then changes over time and evolves into what it is, in the early 1900s, which is very different from what it was.
Yeah, and maybe they don't make that argument. That would be a better argument to make. But at the same time, there's a little bit of a difference between having a shot of Cornshaw whiskey and being married to a second woman that Joseph seals the marriage. Wouldn't you say?
I would say.
I would say that there's a slight difference between having a Lowenbrow and being married to someone else. Especially in a religion that states that marriage is essential for exaltation.
I guess it depends who you're married to, comparing it to a Lowenbrow.
Well, I mean, hams for some people. We got several people listening who are like, you know what? I'm in a hams marriage. My husband is hams. He's old E. So again, I can't get inside what this author's saying, but they are making this claim. In that revelation, Emma was commanded to stop preventing Joseph from being obedient and to accept all those that would be presented to her. This suggests Joseph wasn't being obedient because Emma wasn't allowing it. But as of that day, it was officially commanded. And so if Emma continued to refuse to allow it, which is what she claims, actually, no, Emma doesn't claim that. Emma doesn't claim that she continued to refuse to allow it. Again, this author is playing very fast and loose with what people actually say. What does Emma actually say? She actually says that Joseph never taught or practiced polygamy. She doesn't say that she continued to refuse to allow it. That isn't said. So again, the author here, the problem is you are being very fast and loose with what the sources actually say. Joseph couldn't obey. And so if Emma continued to refuse to allow it, which is what she claims, Joseph couldn't obey. Now, this demonstrates a pretty poor reading of Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, actually. Because what does it say if Emma continues to reject the principle that she's apparently already covenanted to? In Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, verse 55, but if she will not abide this commandment, then shall my servant Joseph do all things for her, even if he has said, and I will bless him and multiply him and give unto him 100-fold in this world of fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, houses and lands, wives and children, and crowns of eternal lives in the eternal worlds. So there's already a provision in there if she doesn't obey this commandment. And it's not, and by the way, God will kill you. Right? That you'll notice I didn't say, and if Emma won't abide the commandment, God will kill you with Sharp's mobbers in Carthage. So I know I'm coming across as very frustrated. But I'm frustrated because I have watched time and time and time again that people who have good intentions, who think that they're helping by creating arguments like this, are actually destroying people's testimonies because they are not solid arguments. And by the way, they go against what the church has said. What is the church saying? Does the church claim that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy? Obviously not. We even quoted a source that the person took us to saying that Joseph practiced polygamy. There are multiple gospel topics essays saying that Joseph practiced polygamy. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of sources, and not all of them are later, as this author will claim. William Clayton's journal is very contemporary, and he is the secretary of the prophet Joseph, and there are dozens of conversations in his journal about the practice of plural marriage, about Joseph practicing plural marriage, about William Clayton practicing plural marriage. To claim that there are no sources is to put your head in the sand and say everyone's a liar who doesn't agree with me. Now that might work when you're doing politics, but it doesn't work when you're doing history. There are dozens and dozens and dozens. Now, look, there is a source. Yes, Emma Smith is a source for saying that Joseph didn't ever practice it. The problem is her source stands in stark contrast to the dozens of other sources, some of them being contemporary. Let me go back to what he was writing. And so if Emma continued to refuse to allow it, which is what she claims, which is, again, not what she claims. She never says, I refuse to allow him to practice polygamy. That is a false statement. Joseph couldn't obey. That is also a false statement because the law of Sarah is that if Emma doesn't use her ability to decide who Joseph is going to be married to, that won't apply anymore, that Joseph will simply have the inspiration and do it on his own because he's being commanded by God. This is probably the part that set me off. And what happens to a prophet that doesn't obey? We know Jonah was swallowed by a whale. Joseph was reluctant to practice polygamy. That's very clear, and it's very clear from several of his plural marriage wives. But that's not what this author's saying. He's saying definitively that Joseph didn't obey God. We know that Jonah was swallowed by the whale. 340 days later, 1 month before Joseph was killed, he testified that he'd been accused of having 7 wives when he could only find 1. This confirms Emma never allowed it. Let me say loud and clear, there is not a single credible PhD holding historian in our church, out of our church, atheist, agnostic, Presbyterian, Church of the Assembly of God, it doesn't matter. There are no PhD holding historians who believe that that is a true statement, that Joseph never practiced polygamy. This confirms that Emma never allowed it. Joseph Smith saying, I've been accused of having 7 wives, but I can only find one, as a public statement. Now he's making that statement after people like William Law have apostatized and are claiming that Joseph Smith is an adulterer and he's practicing spiritual wifery. Many historians believe that what Joseph is doing, certainly church historians believe, that what Joseph is doing is he's speaking to a technicality. What's the technicality? These early plural marriages were not marriages in which someone got a marriage certificate from the local courthouse and went down and had it signed, sealed, and delivered. They were religious ceremonies. But the fact that they were religious ceremonies did not mean that they were not real marriages in every sense of the word. It becomes very confusing. Part of the reason why it's so hard to talk about plural marriage is there are all kinds of sealings that are going on in Nauvoo. They are doing adoptionary sealings that we don't even understand anymore. Today, we only do adoptionary sealings if someone's legally adopted into your family, then you do an adoptionary sealing. Not them. They were doing adoptionary sealings based upon people they wanted to be with in the eternities. So I'm going to be sealed to Brigham Young because Brigham Young baptized me. It doesn't mean I'm married to Brigham Young. It means I want to be connected to his family. And so that allows for the fact that there are different types of sealings that are going on. But it's a huge overstatement to say, oh, and there's no evidence that Joseph was married in the sense of the word married with conjugal relations to any of his wives. Joseph making that statement is making a technical truth. As far as the state of Illinois is concerned, and that's where the accusations are coming from, right? He is not legally married to other women. He is religiously sealed to some of them and living with some of them as husband and wife. This is the same thing that's going to happen in Utah. In Utah, the federal government is going to make polygamy illegal after they've already been practicing it for decades. And so after that, the Latter-day Saints don't just keep getting marriage licenses from the local courthouse for their plural marriage. They are religious ceremonies in which people are sealed and they live together as husband and wife because it's God's law. Now, we see this all the time with other things. We just don't care about it because it's marriage. Marriage is the only thing we care about because it's something that's so personal to all of us. But look, we have on the records of our church billions of people that, maybe billions, at least hundreds of millions, I would guess, that we've done baptisms for. But does that mean the fact that we've done it is very much binding to us? Why don't you go ask the family of some of those people that don't believe in our church, whether it's binding to them, right? Oh yeah, you baptized my great-great-grandmother into your church? Go find how many people actually believe that that's a real baptism. You're going to find nobody, because nobody believes that baptism for the dead is a real thing. So we obviously believe that there are religious ceremonies that we can hold that are not legally binding on the rest of the world, that are legally binding to us, that we see as binding, right? So that's an important thing to understand. Emma also testified to her dying day that Joseph never had any relations with anyone else ever. The author does now provide a note. Note, this doesn't mean that Joseph wasn't sealed to women in the temple, but there were never any official marriages as husband and wife. Now, I don't know if they're trying to codify what I just said there. They're trying to clarify it. I mean, what do you mean by official? If you mean that the state of Illinois only has one marriage record and that's him and Emma, and they don't even have that because states don't have sources that they share like that. The place that has that is actually in New York because that's where they actually got their marriage. but that you mean that they weren't actually married and living as husband and wife. Joseph Smith was killed on June 27, 1844, at 38 years old. Brigham Young became the next prophet and instituted plural marriage. That is a categorically false statement. Find the source that says he instituted it. He continues it. Again, we have multiple contemporary sources that say it's already being practiced. So you can't institute something that's already going on. That's kind of the definition of the word institute. Again, Joseph is the person who seals William Clayton to Margaret Moon, his wife's sister. That's a contemporary document from a contemporary journal. So how could Brigham Young institute plural marriage if Joseph is already sealing people? And frankly, William Clayton's journal demonstrates that Emma is well aware of both plural marriage and that other people are practicing it. When Margaret gets pregnant, well, that's going to be a pretty big scandal. How are you going to hide that? Then in almost every state in the Union, adultery is considered a crime. It's illegal. It's not just, oh, shucks, man, you're probably going to get wiped out in the divorce. Because remember, divorces don't exist. So, they barely exist. So it's a crime that is a criminal offense to commit adultery.
We were going to do another fun with adultery bit, but you kind of took one of the main things.
You were going to ask how many states was adultery.
But now I can't.
And everyone's going to be like, I'm sure it's legal in Nevada. Got you. Nevada wasn't a state yet. It wasn't even a territory yet. In fact, it's part of Mexico. But the important takeaway from this is that in this journal, when Margaret becomes pregnant, it is Emma who suggests ways to hide Margaret away from society so that people don't see that she's pregnant and unmarried as far as the world is concerned, even though she's been sealed by the prophet Joseph Smith. To claim that Brigham Young instituted plural marriage when you have a record like this of Joseph performing those marriages, it just demonstrates that the author is more worried about making their argument than they are about being accurate, which has already been displayed multiple times. I'll make my argument. I'll make it sound pithy. I'll make it sound concrete, and I'll also be wrong. Now, maybe they're trying to cape up for Brigham Young, which I love. I love that, because what does he say next? Brigham Young lived to be an old man and died having lived a full life. Okay, so Brigham Young obeyed it, and so therefore he didn't get killed by God.
This is a bit of a twist. Usually people throw Brigham under the bus to prop up Joseph. This seems like literally the opposite.
Yeah, but it's all still coming from the same place.
Trying to explain it.
Trying to claim that Joseph Smith didn't really practice polygamy. Now, their reasons why they're arguing it are different. They're arguing it because, well, see, now I can explain why Joseph died, because he didn't practice it the way he was supposed to. But the whole point is you're still trying to make the false point. Joseph didn't practice polygamy is the argument. Whether you're arguing that because you can't bring your sensibilities to conceive of the fact that God commanded him to practice it, or whether you're arguing it because you think that Brigham Young's the only true prophet who ever lived, or whether you are some member of some other, apostate group that's arguing it for another reason, it makes very little difference why you're making the argument that is completely historically false. And again, it is one thing to say, I really don't feel comfortable with polygamy. I don't feel comfortable with polygamy. I don't understand how polygamy worked, even having studied it. I don't understand why God commanded it. But not feeling comfortable with it and not understanding it is not the same thing as saying it didn't happen. And that's where this perniciousness has gotten at this point in the church. There are lots of people that are being led away down false paths that we don't know where they end up. Maybe by really well-meaning people who really believe that Joseph never taught it and Joseph never practiced it. But the reality is, he did. Section 132 is part of our scriptures. There are both contemporary and later sources that all say that he did. And by the way, our current church, currently led by current prophets and current apostles, say that he did. So if you think you're making an argument that Joseph never practiced polygamy and you're in line with the church, you aren't. Go read anything on the church's website about polygamy and find me the place where it says Joseph Smith never practiced it. It didn't come from Joseph Smith. Go find me the place. I mean, heavens, even the source that this author cited said that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. So to me, it's a frustrating thing when someone claims they're trying to defend the church by arguing that the church is wrong about what the church is saying. Appreciate your concern, but how about you let President Nelson do President Nelson? You don't get to tell him what he's right and what he's wrong about. That's the prerogative of a prophet. And there's a lot of people online who are self-proclaimed prophets who've got it all figured out, exactly what the Lord's voice said when the Lord spoke to Joseph Smith. It doesn't mean that they're right. It means that they have a platform and people want to hear what they have to say. But that doesn't mean they're right. Certainly doesn't mean that they're doing a historical argument, because they are not. This person goes on. 30 years after Joseph died, William McLellin revived the Fanny accusation and claimed that Emma told him herself. Now that is true. And this author and I can both agree on the fact that William McLellin is a lying piece of garbage. I mean, apostles and apostates and apothecaries. I mean, hopefully he gets some apothecaries that put him down as an apostate apostle. I mean, He tells multiple lies over the course of his life. He changes his story over and over and over again. In a letter to Joseph Smith III, he is going to claim that he had a conversation with Emma and that Emma told him about this. In fact, let's read the actual source, should we? Because we're doing a lot of this just say whatever we want to say garbage. How about we actually read what the source says instead of telling people what the source says? That's our jam anyway, right? So this is a letter that William McLellin writes to Joseph Smith III in 1872. Now, William McLellin has, since his apostasy, so he's excommunicated. He was a member of the original Quorum of the 12. He has actually bounced around and joined and founded multiple different churches. He's affiliated with the Whitmerites for a time. He's affiliated with the Hedrickites that are part of the Temple lot. So William McLellin's bounced around, and he's in opposition to Joseph Smith III's claim, because Joseph Smith III, of course, is claiming that he's, descended from the prophet, and that's part of his truth claim to being a prophet. William McLellin is attempting to undermine Joseph Smith's position to bolster his own. Yeah, Joseph was a prophet, but he became a fallen prophet. So you don't have any authority from him because he became a fallen prophet. But don't worry, I was an apostle and I have authority. I mean, it's always very interesting. People always make these arguments that are always about how they have authority. It's never about how other people do. It's always like, well, next thing you know, Jesus appeared to me and, well, shucks, I became the new prophet. I mean, it's always that.
Well, so I will say one of the things that is pointed out by the author as he's pointing to this is that he says that William McLellin brings it up again, but originally he says that this is the earliest source that we have is essentially.
He says there wasn't a source until 30 years later, and then misquoted the church as saying that.
But then also says, how can a person bring it up again if there was never any source?
I mean, Joseph goes before the High Council in Missouri and explains what happened with it. We don't have any records of that High Council, unfortunately, but we do have the record that he goes before the High Council, and they are all satisfied with his explanation. So I don't know what transpired with that, but the people who were on the ground at the time accepted Joseph's explanation of whatever was related to Fanny Alger, which is, again, something that happened contemporarily. Claiming that there's no source is just, it's a way of befuddling people. So William McLellin's letter to Joseph Smith III, he says, "Now, Joseph, I will relate to you some history." That's my William McLellin voice.
That's pretty good.
Do you want me to get, can I make it a little more? "Now, Joseph,
well, no, that's
I
the
will
answer.
relate to you some history and refer to your own dear mother for the truth." That's a little too graphic.
Where is William McLellin from?
What is he, from Connecticut or something?
Okay,
I have to look it up.
So he's like,
get our crack research team.
Okay, I'll get it on.
Yeah. Now, Joseph, I will relate to you some history and refer to your own dear mother for the truth. Refer you to your own dear mother. So he's saying, you go ask Emma. You will probably remember that I visited your mother and family in 1847 and held a lengthy conversation with her. You will probably remember. So let me get this straight. 30 years ago, I visited you guys and we had a long conversation. Do you remember that, Joseph? Do you remember that? Remember that time, that 30 years ago? You know, after I apostatized and claimed that Joseph was a fallen prophet, and then I just come to like hang out and be like, hey, how's everything going? Things are fine, right? So he says, you held a lengthy conversation with her and retired in the mansion house in Nauvoo. I did not ask her to tell, but I told her some stories that I had heard, and she told me whether I was properly informed. Dr. Frederick G. Williams practiced with me in Clay County, Missouri during the latter part of 1838, except Frederick G. Williams came back to the church. Meanwhile, you did not. And he told me that at your birth, so at his birth, your father committed an act with Miss Hill. That's what's written in there is Miss Hill. It's not even a mention of Fanny Alger there. It will come later. A hired girl. Emma saw him and spoke to him. He desisted, but Mrs. Smith refused to be satisfied. He called in Dr. Williams, Oliver Cowdery, and Sidney Rigdon to reconcile Emma, but she told them just as the circumstances took place. He found that he was caught. He confessed humbly and begged forgiveness. Emma and all forgave him. She told me this story was true, multiple exclamation points. And again, I told her I heard that one night she missed Joseph and Fanny Alger. She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through a crack and saw the transaction, 3 exclamation points. She told me this story was verily true. Now this, I hate the fact that, you know, from this source we're even discussing, because it's such a terrible source from this apostate many years later, claiming that he had a conversation that we can't tell whether it took place, never having spoken about it until 30 years later, and then also claiming, oh, don't worry, Emma can verify that, which of course she does not. But that's where the accusation comes that Joseph Smith was caught committing adultery, and that's the reason why he invented the idea of polygamy. You'll hear people say that. You'll hear anti-Mormons say that. But the reality is, William McLellin, whose entire truth claim rests on the fact that Joseph became a fallen prophet, ergo he has authority, is making this claim of a conversation that we don't even know whether or not it happened. Now, here's where it starts to veer off a little bit, it's already veered off. We're just starting to veer. Yeah?
Yeah, we haven't driven off the cliff. Like Toonsis the driving cat from an old Saturday Night Live skit.
By then, it was, quote unquote, the author writes, cool to have plural wives. Just as it is common in virtually every fervent movement for bandwagoners to fabricate claims to fit in with the cool crowd. Some of Joseph's alleged plural wives claimed they had been in full-blown marriages with Joseph. One even claimed to have kids, but genetic testing proved it was a lie. Now, there's a lot of problems going on there. First of all, that no one's claiming that they were a plural wife of Joseph Smith until the 1870s. Is that what the claim is? Because that's decidedly before that. Second of all, listen to what you're saying. You're saying that all of these women, including Eliza R. Snow, are all liars. They're all claiming that they had marital relations with Joseph Smith to be cool. That's what you're saying. But his isn't the only account. And trying to make it seem like it was, as a way of explaining why Joseph Smith was killed, is reprehensible. It's offensive to me. It is at worst, I mean, it's at best amateurish history by someone not trained to do history very clearly. It's at worst a slander against dozens of some of the leading women of this church. No, I don't think that they're all just liars. I don't think Mercy Fielding is lying about the fact she was sealed to Hiram Smith. I don't believe that. But you just said that they are. So maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe you wrote this thinking it wasn't going to be a big deal. But maybe you shouldn't be claiming something that the church doesn't say. If you really are a defender of the church, then one of the most important things to do is to say what they say. Go to the church's website and find this terrible argument. Oh, wait, you won't find it, even though you'll find references to it in this. I don't know if those references are just the person is so bad at what they do that they don't realize this reference doesn't help them, or if they're deliberately put in to deceive people. I mean, I want to believe the former, but boy, you get further and further into this, it's harder not to believe the latter, isn't it? Because of these lies, we generally accept Joseph did something that he himself testified right before his death that he never did. Who will you believe? Because of these lies. So, Mr. X presenter, you are claiming that Eliza R. Snow is a liar. Now, I realize that the author may not have fully comprehended what they were saying with that line, that these stories were just made up later. But it not only flies in the face of our historical record, it also is a huge indictment, which I don't know who wrote this original post. I don't know who this person is, but what they're alleging is that all of these women lied by the way that they're trying to explain this. Poetess of Zion, wife of Joseph and Brigham Young, second president of the Relief Society, is a liar because she thought it was cool. Explain that to us. I have held Eliza R. Snow's journal that she wrote when she was crossing the plains, filled with faith and devotion in the midst of all kinds of horrible circumstances. It's a little journal, not even the size of my hand. But go on and tell me how she's just trying to be cool. I realize that this person may not have meant to slander those women. I realize that. And it's true that family members, not the women themselves, but family members would later claim that they were descended from Joseph Smith's plural marriages. And in those cases that we've been able to test with DNA, they are not. At the same time, you have people like Melissa Lott, who's a fully faithful, active member of the church, who testifies in open court that she lived with Joseph Smith as a wife. You have women who, like Lucy Walker, who testifies multiple times that she lived with Joseph Smith as a wife and that Emma knew that she was one of his wives. You cannot cavalierly throw the testimonies of some of the great women of the Restoration out on some kind of technicality. Yeah, Joseph Smith said, I can only find one, because as far as the state of Illinois is concerned, he was only married in Illinois parlance to one woman. But we have all kinds of evidence that he was sealed to more than one woman, and not just sealings in the temple for eternity. There are women living in his household. And William Clayton's journal, contemporary journal, is a prime evidence of that. The fact that Joseph is performing sealings that are plural sealings that involve conjugal relations is evidence that this is what Joseph is teaching. But I don't know whether the author even knows that. I'm not sure what made them make this line of argument, but I know that they've been deceived. And one of the primary ways you know is this is not the argument that the church is making. Look, I say all kinds of things, but only when I make a mistake am I arguing against what the church is currently teaching, which I might. Look, I talk a lot and poorly. Yeah. I mean, Richard doesn't attempt to deny that.
No, I wouldn't even begin.
Yeah. So, he then finishes with this, who will you believe? So we're deciding between whether or not Joseph Smith is in a public declaration of a refutation of an adultery accusation, attempting to diffuse that, or that all these other people are just liars. Here's part of the problem too. You want to cape up for Brigham Young? You want to say that we're going to follow what Brigham Young did, that Brigham Young lived a long life because he didn't violate the commandment to practice polygamy because he did practice it? Well, how about we go listen to what Brigham Young has to say then? Since he's the prophet we're holding up as the one not swallowed by the whale, let's go find out what prophet not swallowed by the whale has to say about Joseph Smith and whether or not Joseph Smith is a righteous man at the time of his death. And here's what Brigham Young has to say. In the aftermath of Joseph Smith's murder, when people are claiming things like, oh, maybe Joseph was fallen and that's why God took him out of the way. By the way, Captain Mr. X poster, you aren't the first person to come up with that argument. So you probably don't know this, but Brigham Young, the prophet that you claim followed God while Joseph didn't, is the one who first refutes that argument. Again, you probably don't know. But if you don't know, maybe let's not make a post claiming that the church is wrong and that dozens of women in church history are liars. Let's not make that post if you don't know. Here's what Brigham Young said. It is the test of our fellowship to believe and confess that Joseph lived and died a prophet of God in good standing. Let me read that to you again. It is a test of our fellowship, meaning you're not a member of the church, to believe and confess that Joseph lived and died a prophet of God in good standing. You know what happened with Jonah and the whale. Guess who doesn't agree with you? Brigham Young. And I don't want anyone to fellowship with the 12 who says that Joseph is fallen. Okay, if your argument is Joseph was prevented from living polygamy and therefore God removed him out of the way, you are in direct contradiction to Brigham Young. If you don't know whose right it is to give revelations, I will tell you, it is I. There has never been a man who stood between Joseph and the 12, and unless we apostatize, there never will. If Hiram had lived, he would not have stood between Joseph and the 12, but he would have stood for Joseph. Did Joseph ordain any man to take his place? He did. Who was it? It was Hiram. But Hiram fell a martyr before Joseph did. If Hiram had lived, he would have acted for Joseph. And then when we had all gone up, the 12 would have sat down at Joseph's right hand and Hiram on the left hand. The Bible says God hath said in the church first apostles, then comes prophets afterwards, because the keys and powers of the apostleship are greater than that of the prophets. Sidney Rigdon cannot hold the keys without Joseph. If he had held the keys with Joseph and been faithful, he would have been with us. If the 12 do not apostatize, they carry the keys of the kingdom wherever they go. He concluded by requesting all the brethren to tarry with us until this business is through. So look, Brigham Young is the one who is adamant that Joseph Smith lived and died as a prophet. John Taylor's testimony on the anniversary of the martyrdom in 1854 is that Joseph lived and died as a prophet. Maybe this person's trying to make some kind of technical argument that Joseph was prevented from practicing polygamy. But the only way they make that argument is by claiming that dozens of people are liars, that sources that exist are all fraudulent. And by the way, they've provided no evidence. And also, very key here, especially for someone who claims they're defending the church, they are claiming that the church's current teaching on Joseph Smith and plural marriage is wrong. But it's not just the current teaching, because there are all kinds of groups who seek to dismiss what it is that the church teaches in its manuals and from its pulpits, saying that there's some kind of conspiracy keeping the truth out, or that the Joseph Smith papers are some kind of inside job with historians changing the doctrine instead of just doing what the prophets are literally telling us to do, as if we were some kind of rogue element instead of being literally told exactly what we should do, having all of our stuff reviewed. Because it's not just a contradiction of what the church is teaching now. And again, I don't know who originally wrote this. They seem to be a member. They seem to be someone who cares about the church, and they're just trying to figure things out. But what they haven't stopped to think about is it's not just the women that you've indicted for wanting to say that they were married to Joseph because it was cool. It is every prophet in the 19th century, as they are dealing with the polygamy crises, as polygamy comes up over and over and over again. They all say that Joseph Smith taught it and Joseph Smith instituted it. So is Brigham Young also lying because it's cool? Is John Taylor lying? Frankly, I think it's pretty obvious. Anyone who's studied the lives of Brigham Young and John Taylor know that those two men don't care what's cool. They aren't going to say that Joseph taught it if they're the ones who taught it. They are more than willing to say that this is a new teaching. Wilford Woodruff ends the adoptionary sealings that have been going on for 50 years and says that it's from God. Wilford Woodruff ends plural marriage. But Wilford Woodruff is also adamant that Joseph Smith is the one who taught it. If you read Phoebe Woodruff's testimony of plural marriage, she will say that's how she knew it was true, because Joseph taught it. And I think that as we rush to try to find explanations from the past that help us feel better in the present, we have to be very careful. Because I doubt that the originator of this post was thinking, oh, I'm calling Brigham Young a liar by posting this. I doubt that they were thinking, oh, I'm calling hundreds of people liars. I'm rejecting dozens of sources. My guess is they had heard what someone else had said about it, clearly a non-scholar. They tried to figure it out in their mind, and then they presented it the way they did. It's important for us to follow what the church is teaching and what those previous prophets have taught as well. And they all say that Joseph Smith taught it. So I don't think we get around it simply by saying, well, it was women who later said that they were married to Joseph, but of course they weren't. That's not what Brigham Young says. So if we're trying to defend Brigham Young, that's not the way to do it. I know that I've come across as strident, and there are a few nerves that I sometimes get frayed. When people assert slanderous lies about women like Eliza R. Snow, yeah, I'm going to be upset. When people claim that Joseph was somehow a fallen prophet, yeah, I'm going to be upset. I get it. It is tough to reconcile the fact that Emma Smith continually denied that Joseph practiced polygamy. It's tough, but at least it's explainable. She did it to protect her family, to protect her son. If anyone knew that you were not going to be able to explain polygamy to someone in a way that was okay to them, it was Emma. I don't know why, but I know that Joseph's going to take care of Emma. I'm not in any way worried about Emma. But I will say, as a historian, there are no historians who accept this person's argument. They can make whatever claim they want to make. They clearly are, publicly declaring it. but they're making it in opposition to what the church teaches, in opposition to what historians of every stripe conclude, and in opposition to the actual sources that exist, and in opposition to what Brigham Young said in the immediate aftermath of Joseph's murder. It is a test of fellowship to believe and confess that Joseph lived and died a prophet of God in good standing. And I don't want anyone to fellowship with the 12 who says that Joseph has fallen. So I know that was more than what people were expecting.
I don't know. I think that we do joke around a decent amount on this podcast, but I think, again, your purpose in going at this the way that you have is to try to prevent what you see over and over again, where people cling to an argument because they like it. It makes sense possibly to them in their mind. Then the carpet is pulled out from underneath them, and they are left in a situation where they feel betrayed, and that is the cause of them leaving the church.
And sometimes, okay, person who posted this, maybe you do succeed in convincing someone that Joseph never practiced polygamy, but they don't believe it the way you do, right? So they now, oh, good. It's so good to know that Joseph never actually practiced polygamy. They aren't believing it the way you are, that's the reason why Joseph was killed and Brigham Young wasn't. They're just believing it because they finally found a way to get past such a difficult topic to them. Then what happens when they realize that your sources are bad, that your quotes are bad, that your application is bad, and that no one else accepts the argument? Suddenly they have a faith crisis because they got convinced by something that was never true in the first place. I know plural marriage is a very difficult topic. I am well aware of it. I have had literally hundreds and hundreds of conversations about it. I get it. But instead of trying to pretend it didn't happen, we should be grateful to Joseph Smith, to Brigham Young, to Eliza R. Snow, to Bathsheba W. Smith, to the men and women who it was much harder for than it was for us, because we're not being asked to practice it. We're just being asked to believe that the same God who commanded prophets in multiple eras of the history of the world to practice polygamy commanded a prophet in this era to practice polygamy. And then eventually, by commandment, that revelation was taken. We're not being asked to practice it. If anyone's asking you to practice polygamy, you have a friend in Colorado City, they're wrong. Okay, that they don't have the ability to tell you to practice it. Wilford Woodruff, the prophet, received revelation, ending new plural marriages. So I understand that it's difficult. But remember that when there's something that is sensitive, that is the area in which Satan most has the ability to affect us by false doctrine and false teachings. Because when we desperately want to believe a thing, it doesn't take us very much at all to believe that thing. Someone comes along and says, look, there's proof. The voice of the Lord told Joseph he'd see the second coming. We want to believe it because we want desperately to get to a place where Joseph didn't practice polygamy. And that opens the door for apostates and perhaps well-meaning people who are misinformed, that are still members, to deceive us. And the problem with deception is once it is made, you don't get to set the bounds of where that deception ends. You might convince someone that no one practiced that polygamy was all fine and good because only 1% of the church ever practiced it, and you throw that number around and you say that that's the reason why it's okay. The problem is what happens when people find out that number isn't accurate. I don't think that we could ever get a testimony of the practice of plural marriage the same way that these people who practiced it did. But their testimonies are not to be thrown out as lies simply because we struggle with them. I get it. We struggle with them. So maybe it's time for us to put our faith in God the same way they did and say, I don't understand this, but I believe Joseph was a prophet. I know that plural marriage is difficult. I know that it is. But I testify to you that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. He was doing what God commanded him to do. He lived and died as a prophet. And if we want to throw out Joseph Smith as a prophet simply because we can't come to terms with that very difficult teaching, then just stop and think about all of the other beautiful doctrines that you lose. Because you don't just lose plural marriage, you lose eternal marriage. You don't just lose the difficulty of sorting out who's a wife to who. You lose the fact that eternal marriage exists at all the moment Joseph becomes a fallen prophet. You lose your premortal life. You lose the universality of salvation to all of God's children. You lose the universality of people having everyone the opportunity to be exalted. You lose all of that because you can't come to terms with what is a very difficult topic. Let's read what those women had to say about it. Let's read what men had to say about it. Some of them had angels appear to them. Is Lucy Walker a liar when she says an angel appeared to her and told her to practice polygamy? Apparently she is, because she wanted to be cool. Don't allow people to derail your focus on what the prophet of the living God today is teaching. If you want to know what the church's position on polygamy is, it's pretty clear. Go to the church's website and read it. We shouldn't be getting any of our definitive understanding of anything related to the church from an X post. Maybe if it's the church's X account.
Well, they have an account.
Yeah,
they direct you to the website. You
There
can
you
read
go.
it.
There you go. Anyway, so I'm sorry that I was a little agitated. This will probably never see the light of day. I'm going to go delete this episode now. And if it does make it out there, it's going to be because Richard, pulled some shenanigans on the tech side of things. And it'd be like, no, we put out that episode where you were talking about, just like baptism and stuff. And then I'll find out a week later.
That's how it's going to happen.
Okay? All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for listening to the Standard of Truth podcast, hosted by historian Dr. Gerrit Dirkmaat. If you know anybody that could benefit from the material in this episode, please share it with them. And for more resources, visit standardoftruth.com. Until next time.